Third lecture this week is on Russian organized crime, more specifically, Organistaya, or the organization, as it's sometimes called. Russian organized crime, while their current power structure was born out of the collapse of the Soviet Union, understand that there were gangs and a criminal element that was at least somewhat organized prior to the 1991 fall of the Soviet Union. Though what we think of as the Russian mafia, such that it's not really a proper term for it, but what we think of Russian organized crime today has its origin in the fall of the Soviet Union. But understand again, there were gangs, there was crime prior to the Soviet Union. There was a vast black market that provided Western goods to members of the Communist Party. There were gangs and a criminal element that stole basic goods and then provided them on the black market or shared them among criminal networks rather than goods that were in shortage or that you had to even though you stood in line for hours to get. Maybe they ran out before you got there. At the end of the Soviet Union, 1991, there were somewhere around 700 criminal gangs in the Soviet Union. They tended to be organized along family lines or organized in a similar fashion to a family. Usually the leader of the gang was referred to as Vory Sakon, V-O-R-Y, the initial V, and then last word Zakon, S-A-K-N-A-N-E. Roughly translated from the Russian, this would be thief-in-law. And these Vory Sakon, they specialized in stealing from government officials and spreading the proceeds to the rest of their criminal network. Remember, the old Soviet Union, while there was money, was not really a cash-driven society. It was an extreme socialist society. While all your needs were met in this society, sometimes you didn't get everything you needed. Those members of the Vory Sakon that were caught were often sent to gulags, which were a type of prison camp, usually in very harsh environments in places like Siberia. While there, they would have their criminal records or symbols of their crimes tattooed on their body, much like the Yakuza, much like criminals in Japan. And those tattoos became, for the criminals, rather than a mark of shame or a mark identifying them as a criminal, they became status symbols, almost business cards for the criminal, where a Russian criminal could hold out his arm and show someone else, here's my resume of crimes that I have committed. It was certainly an indicator of what they've done and who they were. Some of these gang members that were in the gulags were actually released during World War II to fight in the Soviet army against the Nazi war machine. Many of them became war heroes on the front, fighting the Nazis. Unfortunately for them, as soon as the war was over, rather than getting accolades or accolades according to their deeds, most of them were put right back in the gulags. Which certainly didn't endear them to the Soviet government. When they eventually left prison, they did so having developed relationships with corrupt government officials and with each other, forming these fairly solid criminal relationships. And truly these gang members that had been released from the gulags formed the foundation, or at least one of the foundations, of current organized crime in the nation of Russia. I could really say that in the modern organized crime of Russia, its members are made up of, there are four founding groups, so to speak, or four sources, four primary sources for membership in the organizacja. Organ is the organization. Russian. Why do we gotta choose to teach classes that are full of words I can't pronounce? Just real spoils the whole mystique of the all-knowing professor now, doesn't it? Anyway, these four sources of people, of members that come into the Russian organized crime, first and foremost are the Russian criminal elite, those that were already in the gangs, the Vordovy Sakhan. But they weren't the only source. There were also the nomenklatura, let me spell it for you, Numenklatura, nomenklatura. These were people that during the Soviet Union were people holding positions of power. Whether there was jobs or political positions. They were almost always members of the Communist Party. They held some sort of political power, and even after the fall of the Soviet Union, these are people that either they held some kind of political power or already had positions of power in some of the private industries that were beginning to gear up during perestroika. The third source are ethnic groups. These were groups of ethnic Russians, groups formed by all different ethnic groups that exist in the Soviet Union. And then the fourth source would be regional crime groups, such as Chechnyan crime groups or Georgian crime groups, such as that. Those are your four sources. Regardless of where they come from, they all seem to have, there is kind of, especially among the Vordovy Sakhan, there is a set of standardized rules that go with being a member, and these were things handed down, from the thieves in law before. There were things like, Russian organized crime, Russian mafia members were not allowed to have families of their own. Wives and girlfriends were okay, not wives and girlfriends. Girlfriends were okay, wives and children were not. Those sort of things, would detract from your loyalty. You were to forsake your own family relatives when you entered the family of the crime family. These guys are forbidden from holding legitimate jobs, which kind of makes them a little different, from other types of organized crime, where other members of other types of organized crime groups like the Cosa Nostra, sometimes are encouraged to hold down legitimate jobs. And you got to have something for the tax return. They have a requirement to assist other thieves and not to give information about other thieves. Their requirement is to make good on promises to other thieves. And I like one of their rules in the list I saw was that don't gamble if you can't afford to pay. I think that's a good rule for everybody, whether you're a member of the Vordovy Sakhan or not. They weren't allowed to do military service, which is ironic, and considering some of the sources of the Russian mob, you'll understand the irony there in a few minutes. No cooperation with law enforcement. Very similar. Some of these rules are very similar to other types of organized crime. But if you're talking on a test about similarities between Russian organized crime and other groups, these rules certainly are a similarity. Seems like organized crime, wherever you are around the world, has some basic rules about not talking about the organization, not cooperating with the police, putting the group above family, very similar to other groups. Regardless, it's not about rules. After the fall of the Soviet Union, these groups became very powerful. As the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia, the Russian Federation, arose out of the ashes of the Soviet Union, as the other nation states that were part of the Soviet Union start breaking away and forming their own countries, and the Russian Federation is trying to switch from extreme socialism to capitalism. They're in the midst of that change. There came about the black market that existed for just selling stuff to the members of the Communist Party, and the privileged elite became greatly expanded so that everyone participated in the black market. Early on after the fall of the Soviet Union, some scholars state that up to 2/3 of the Russian economy was controlled by the organized crime groups. I'll give you a specific in 1997, which is 5-6 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. 40% of all private industries were controlled by organized crime. 40% of the banks were controlled by organized crime. And interestingly enough, 60% of these state-controlled businesses were controlled by organized crime. Again, if you consider the nomenclatura, you've got to figure out why. There was, and there still continues to be, corruption at all levels of the government. At one point, the Internal Affairs Division within the Russian government reported 6,000 cases of corruption within the military during a single calendar year. One of the other interesting things I find about the formation of the current organized crime group is, while we're still talking about a collection of several gangs, in 1991, the most powerful leaders of the Vorivisitan got together and discussed, put their heads together, and brainstormed ways they could take advantage of the new economic realities in Russia, and actually planned out how they were going to take economic advantage of the downfall of the Soviet Union, and how they were going to move their operations from Russia into the United States. And there was the move of Russian mobsters and the so-called Russian mafia into the United States was planned. Whereas other groups, as opportunities arose, they took advantage of the opportunities. Here you have a group of mobsters thinking, okay, what we really want to do is move into the American markets, and how are we going to do that? And how are we going to take advantage of the economic collapse in our own nation to facilitate our move to the United States? One of the big differences, and here I'm going to highlight one of the big differences between Russian organized crime and organized crime in other places, is then you realize with the Yakuza, with La Cosa Nostra, with the Italian mob in America, you often see the organized crime groups, while they're making great profit at the expense of others, and even expense of their own communities, there's always a portion where these groups are reinvesting profits back into their community, back into their country. You don't see that with the Russian mob. While the Russian mob is robbing the Russian people and robbing the Russian government blind, they're not reinvesting back into the Russian economy. Rather, they are hoarding their funds in Swiss banks, bringing their funds to the United States, bringing their businesses to the United States, and it is at least a partial cause for economic struggles in Russia. It's not just the crime committed by these Russian mobsters that's hurting the Russian economy, but it is also very much the fact that the crime groups are not reinvesting back in the community. I mean, Palermo after World War II, grew into a fairly successful city. It managed to rebuild with a lot of help from the mob, even though the mafia was taking advantage. You don't see that in Russia. You don't see the reinvestment. It's almost like the Russian mob is getting everything it can get out of where they are, and then they're going to leave. We talk about structure and organization of the Russian mob. We're looking at about 20 organizations that are considered global organized crime groups. They are very diverse. With organizational structure, I mean, they're very diverse in the different types of organizational structure, and so it makes it hard to generalize. They're not highly centralized, but rather divided into a small number of groups. Kind of almost like a cell structure. One common structure I did find in my own research, to try and prepare for lectures. There's one common structure where you have a single boss, who would be called a Kresni Otets. I swear I'm going to get Google Voice to pronounce some of these things for me. Let's see, we're going to try this out here while I'm making the video. We will try out Dr. Day's Google Voice, and we'll see how well this works. We're going to try to translate the word that would mean boss in English, and I'm going to try to transport it in Russian. Let's see if, just for fun. Alright, here we go. Krestini, which is how you spell the word, and then Otets, there's two words. I don't want to translate it into Spanish. I certainly don't want to translate it into French. Let's try English. That's not what I want. Well, I guess that's not going to do. Oh, here we go. Krestinidiotids. Yeah, well, there you go. And it didn't translate it at all. But the Kresniotnes is the boss. He will have two underbosses under him. Their title is Voivysakan. And then under all of them will be groups of soldiers called Boyeviks, Boyevik. The Boyeviks, again, these are the soldiers, the crew members, the guys that actually do all the crime. Another type of organization we might see with these Russians are led by a job title named the Pakan. Let's see if we can try this one. Pakan. It should be boss. It, of course, does not translate. Probably because I spelled it wrong. Pakhan. Pakan. And translated in English is... Down the Google Translate doesn't speak Russian very well. Or that's a proper noun that doesn't translate well. Anyway, you would have a Pakan, a boss. He would control 4 cells of Boyeviks. Then under the Boyeviks would be enforcers, the tough guys. Many gangs, if you get away from this structure, other gangs, very structured under military type lines where you have groups with specific specializations. And in this case, you would have at the top of the hierarchy, you would have an elite group. This would be your management personnel, your boss. This would be your folks that handle management, organization, your group that handles your development plans, your long-term strategies for your organized crime group. These would be the guys that would get together with other crime groups and decide how they were going to take advantage of a failing Soviet economy. And then beneath those groups, you would have maybe a support group. And then the support group would be... the support group's job would be to plan specific crimes, and of course, and then in that hierarchy, beneath the support group would be the working group, and these would be your specialists that actually commit the crime. So you would have a group at the top that does long-term planning. You would have a group underneath them that actually plans specific criminal operations, and then a working group under that, which would be the guys who would actually carry out those plans, those criminal groups. And then in a separate part of the hierarchy, under the supervision of the elite group, would be a security group. And this would be the guys that handle both security for the organization and would do intelligence gathering. Guys who would gather information that the support group and the working group could take advantage of. Oh, look at that. We're going to get a new email system next year. Yay, no more Tiger Mail. Aren't you all happy? Y'all don't care. The faculty are probably jumping up and down for joy at this moment, this announcement. All right. Remember I talked about 4 sources of members for organized crime in Russia. I talked about the ethnic groups and the regional groups and the Fortovitsakan. Then there was the other group, the Nomenklatura. These are the scary guys. When we talk about Russian organized crime, the Nomenklatura, the guys that came out of the Communist Party, the guys that came out of positions of power, these are the real scary Russian mobsters. Prior to 1991, these are the guys that were members of the Communist Party, and so these were sophisticated, highly educated individuals. With other types of organized crime, sometimes your leaders, sometimes your members may have some education. They might have, your consigliere, he might be a lawyer, so he's going to be highly educated. But, a lot of these big mob bosses, you remember our histories, the histories I tell you about different big mafia figures, one of the more common things you hear is dropped out of high school, dropped out of school at age 14, things like that. I mean, these are guys that start early in a life of crime and leave school behind. Well, these elite Russian mobsters, these guys, these nomenklatura, these guys coming from the Communist Party, are very different because they're very sophisticated individuals. They are highly educated. They tend to use a lot of modern technology in their business. But when I talk about them being highly educated, I mean, these are guys with at least a bachelor's, if not a master's degree, or the equivalent thereof, in academic fields like economics and physics and engineering. These are guys that, when they make long-term plans about how to take advantage of the economic situation in Russia, these are guys that, when they're making plans, they know what they're talking about because they have advanced degrees in economics. When these guys are talking about using modern technology to further their crimes, these are guys with degrees in physics and engineering. That makes them very much a threat to the world. And then, on top of the great deal of education these guys are, a great deal of them are former members of the KGB. The KGB being the Soviet Union's version of our Central Intelligence Agency. KGB being the Russian secret police, they're spies. And so you get an interesting combination of people trained in espionage and clandestine operations and a great deal of education, and then you turn them into criminals. Imagine, I hate to use this term, I love Ian Fleming books, but imagine James Bond as a criminal. And you get the idea. I guess for some of you younger kids, your generation, imagine Jason Bourne. Well, that's probably not a very good one. The movies on those are really silly. If you've ever read one of the books that was written, the 3 original Jason Bourne books, imagine him as a criminal. Scary. Very. Their expertise, while other groups are into drug smuggling and narcotics, and what these guys do a bit of that, their real expertise is in exploiting financial institutions, doing illegal exports of Russia's natural resources, and extortion, which is another one of their specialties. They get into the narcotics, but that's usually other parts of the Fortovitsakan that's handling the narcotics and the murder. And these guys are the more sophisticated type crimes. They are, for obvious reasons, for reasons you can probably imagine by now, the most dangerous of the Russian organized crime members. They do have their own set of enforcers, the Krychas, and to give you an example of their ruthlessness, the Krychas in 1995 were responsible for the murder of 400 members of Russia's Ministry of Internal Affairs. In the United States, Russian organized crime tends to be composed of ad hoc groups that are gathered for specific purposes. but they do have hierarchies that are more, even more horizontal in nature than they are in Russia. More vertical. They tend to be led by very powerful, very influential leaders. But they are, like other organized crime groups, very quick to adapt. They change to economic, political, and law enforcement realities very easy. Individual groups of the Russian mob here in the United States tend to be small. 5 to 20 members in general. Again, formed around a specific criminal activity, and tend to be grouped by region. For example, there's a Chechnyan group, like the Chechnyan mobsters tend to be very highly organized. They tend to pattern themselves after La Cosa Nostra, but they are maybe different from other Russian organized crime. Say, for example, there's a group in in Northern California, that are a group of Ukrainians combined with a few Western Russians that specialize particularly in auto theft and run a string of chop shops throughout Northern California. And on the side, they do a little narcotics and extortion and prostitution, but they have a specialization. And so you see an example of a small group of Russian organized crime members bound together by an ethnic identity, in this case the Chechnyans, and specializing in a specific type of crime, auto theft. There is probably two of the more well-known Russian groups are a group known as one of them is the group called the Odessa Mafia, running out of Brighton Beach in the Northeast. They specialize in money laundering and fraud and loan sharking, and do a little murder and narcotics on the side. Again, they are also highly structured, maybe even more structured than the mob back home. And then there is an Armenian group out in Hollywood, California. They're one of the larger groups, as they have about 450 suspected members. One of their big claims to fame is fuel fraud. And a little bit more about fuel fraud in a minute. They also get involved in extortion, credit card fraud, narcotics, kidnapping. They're also heavily attached to the nomenklatura back in Mother Russia, in that they specialize in the export, or in this case the import, of stolen or misappropriated natural resources from Russia. In particular, tin, copper, aluminum, bronze, and weapons-grade uranium. Yes, I did say weapons-grade uranium. Be afraid, be very afraid. This particular Armenian group is clearing about $1 billion a month, bringing in natural resources from Russia, including, again, weapons-grade uranium. Now, I said I'd tell you a little bit more about fuel fraud. For a specific incident in 1995, 13 members of this Armenian group were convicted of fuel fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and extortion. Their particular group, they were profiting about 42 cents a gallon off of fuel fraud. Now, what fuel fraud is, and fuel fraud, they're making about $2 billion. $2 billion. Well, in a 5-year period, between 1990 and 1995, they made about $2 billion. Not as much as the $1 billion a month off of uranium and other natural resources, but still quite a big check of money. And they have a pretty good process for it. And again, this is from this Armenian group in Northern California. Keep an eye if you go visit Northern California. Pay attention to the gas stations you go to. What they tend to do is they will create a fictitious company called a burn company, and they will, out of this burn company, they will operate convenience store type gas stations, but they will alter the fuel chemistry. They will either sell low grade fuel labeled as high grade fuel, or just as common, they will alter the fuel chemistry of gas so that they can sell lower grade fuel for higher grade fuel. Remember what these guys their degrees are in? Physics, chemistry. They will rig fuel pumps to cheat customers. They will just go as far as just don't pay the taxes. On average, these guys are making, in this group of 95, at their 42 cents a gallon, that was kind of a low ball. These groups now, these Armenian mobsters, these days in California, are clearing about 50 cents a gallon, pocketing about 50 cents a gallon just in taxes. Not to mention, the fact that they're cheating people on the gas. You can sometimes recognize gas being sold by the Russian mob in California. Is if you come, those corners where you have a gas station on every corner, the gas station with the lowest price could very probably be Russian mob, because they have a habit of selling their gas at a lower cost, or at least for a lower price per gallon than the other competitors. So they're bringing in more business, and then they're cheating the customers when they get there. When I talked about this on the residential class, a student said something about, "Oh, you mean like Walmart?" But I said, "No, not like Walmart. Walmart, you get, when it says 87 octane on the pump at Walmart, you actually get 87 octane. Yeah, one of these Armenian mob stations, when the tank says 87 octane on the side of the gas tank, gas pump, what you're really probably getting is something less." The other specializations for the Russian mob is cybercrime. They're very heavily into cybercrime. Their particular, it's probably two claims to fame that the Russian mob is taking advantage of online betting companies. That basically the Russian mob will tell these folks, "Okay, we're not going to mess with your company, but here's the deal: you can give us a cut of your profits, or we're going to shut you down." And then the Russian mob employs a great number of hackers that will come in and shut down the websites of online, shut down online gambling sites when the owners refuse to give the Russians a cut of their profit. They're also very heavily into music and movie pirating. Let's just say in Russia, about 95% of all music sold in Russia is pirated. Cost for U.S. dollars about $310 million a year in lost revenue to American music producers. It's not some pleasant people. Just a few other things the Russian mob gets involved in. They do heavily get into medical and auto insurance fraud. They do drug trafficking. They are closely associated with some of the Mexican cartels that we'll talk about next week. And their association with the Mexican cartels is often dealing with not the actual trafficking of the drugs, though they do some of that. But a lot of their association has to do with money laundering. About 30% of some of the Mexican DTO or drug trafficking organizations' money is laundered through or laundered by the Russian mafia. But then again, like I said, they do some of their own. Some of their own narcotics trafficking, just a little. There was a point in April where some Russian mobsters were caught with about 13 tons of cocaine outside of Acapulco. About 10 Russian and Ukrainian criminals that were captured along with that. So they do some of the trafficking. Okay, that's just a little supplement on what you can read about in the textbook about the Russian mafia. And so we'll call this video 3. And then in the next video, which hopefully won't be too long, of course, I spoke about this stuff for an hour. Well, maybe not. Anyway, in the next video, I will talk about the Kurdish Workers' Party. And goodbye.